In the middle of the vast Pacific Ocean lies an island so remote that for centuries it existed almost untouched by human influence. From the air, it appears as a ring of emerald forest surrounded by cliffs of volcanic rock. Turquoise waves break against the shoreline, and dense tropical vegetation blankets the interior. At first glance, the island seems like a paradise. But beneath the surface of this isolated ecosystem, something was deeply wrong. The forest floor was eerily quiet. Leaves accumulated year after year without being broken down. Seedlings struggled to grow beneath layers of decaying organic matter. The once thriving nutrient cycle that sustained the island's biodiversity had begun to stall. And scientists believe they knew why. For decades, one of the island's most important ecological engineers had been missing: crabs. Across tropical islands around the world, land crabs play a surprisingly powerful role in maintaining ecological balance. Acting as both scavengers and gardeners, they break down leaf litter, redistribute nutrients, and shape the structure of entire forest ecosystems. Without them, the delicate machinery of the forest begins to malfunction. And so a bold idea began to take shape. What would happen if millions of crabs were suddenly returned to an island that had lived without them for decades? Would the ecosystem recover? Or would the sudden arrival of so many animals create a disaster no one could control? Scientists were about to find out. The island had not always been silent. Historical records and early ecological surveys suggested that centuries ago, enormous populations of land crabs once covered the forest floor. During certain seasons, the ground would move with life. Millions of crabs would emerge from burrows beneath the soil, marching through the undergrowth in vast migrations toward the sea. These events were so large they could be seen from the air, entire hillsides shimmering with red and purple shells. These crabs were not simply residents of the island. They were the ecosystem's foundation. Each year they consumed enormous quantities of leaf litter, fallen fruit, and organic debris. A single adult land crab could process nearly 10 kilograms of plant material annually. Multiply that by millions of individuals, and the ecological impact becomes staggering. Researchers estimate that in healthy tropical island forests, land crabs may process up to 80% of all fallen leaves on the forest floor. By shredding and consuming plant material, crabs accelerate decomposition, releasing vital nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus back into the soil. This process fuels plant growth, supports insects, and ultimately sustains entire food webs. In many ways, land crabs function like the earthworms of tropical islands. Without them, forests begin to suffocate under their own organic waste. And on this island, that process had already begun. The collapse started slowly. In the early 20th century, ships began visiting the island more frequently. Cargo vessels, fishing boats, and supply ships anchored offshore, bringing humans and unintended passengers. Among them were rats. These small mammals quickly spread through the forest, climbing trees and scavenging along the ground. While they fed on many things, they found one food source particularly easy to exploit: crab larvae. Land crabs begin their lives in the ocean. Adult females release thousands of microscopic larvae into the sea, where they drift in coastal waters before eventually returning to land as tiny juvenile crabs. But rats discovered that these young crabs were defenseless. By the mid-1900s, rat populations had exploded across the island. And crab populations collapsed. Within just a few decades, millions of crabs vanished from the ecosystem. The forest was transformed. Without crabs to consume fallen leaves, thick layers of plant debris accumulated across the ground. In some areas, scientists measured leaf litter depths exceeding 15 centimeters, far deeper than normal for tropical forests. Seedlings that once sprouted easily now struggled to reach sunlight. The structure of the forest began to change. Plants that thrived in thick organic layers, particularly invasive vines and shade-tolerant shrubs, began spreading rapidly. Meanwhile, species that relied on open soil conditions started disappearing. The ecological balance that had existed for thousands of years was unraveling. For decades, scientists debated what could be done. Some argued the ecosystem might eventually adapt. Others believed that without intervention, the island could permanently lose much of its original biodiversity. But there was a problem. Restoring crab populations would not be simple. Even if crabs were reintroduced, rats would almost certainly consume their young before they could establish new populations. Any restoration effort would require two enormous steps. First, removing the rats. And second, returning millions of crabs to the island. It was a plan that sounded almost impossible. Yet in the early 2000s, a coalition of conservation biologists, island ecologists, and environmental restoration organizations decided to attempt exactly that. The first phase was one of the largest invasive species removal projects ever attempted on a remote island. Over the course of several months, teams deployed thousands of bait stations across the island's rugged terrain. Helicopters flew low over the forest canopy, distributing carefully measured bait pellets designed to eliminate rat populations without harming native species. The operation covered more than 40 square kilometers of dense tropical forest. Monitoring stations were placed across the island to track changes in wildlife populations. Within a year, something remarkable happened. Rat sightings dropped dramatically. Soon they disappeared entirely. The island had been cleared of one of its most destructive invaders. But the real challenge was only beginning. With the rats gone, scientists turned their attention to the next stage: reintroducing the crabs. Rather than waiting decades for crab populations to recover naturally, researchers designed an ambitious intervention. They would transport juvenile crabs from nearby islands where populations remained healthy. Over several years, conservation teams carefully collected young crabs, each only a few centimeters wide, and relocated them to the restoration island. Special containers were used to maintain humidity and temperature during transport. Once released, the crabs would burrow into the soil and begin adapting to their new environment. The numbers were staggering. In the first major release, over 1 million juvenile crabs were introduced into the forest. Over the following years, that number grew. 2 million. 5 million. Eventually, scientists estimated that more than 10 million crabs had been returned to the island. At first, the changes were subtle. Tiny crabs scattered across the forest floor, disappearing beneath leaves and soil. Most were too small to notice. But researchers knew that even small individuals could begin influencing the ecosystem. Every leaf consumed, every burrow dug, every fragment of organic material processed would slowly begin restarting the island's natural nutrient cycle. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some ecologists worried about unintended consequences. Introducing millions of animals into an ecosystem, even a native species, could potentially trigger unexpected chain reactions. Would the crabs consume too many seedlings? Would they disrupt nesting birds? Would they compete with other animals for food? And perhaps most importantly, would they even survive? For months, scientists waited. Field teams returned regularly to monitor burrow density, leaf litter levels, and vegetation changes. At first, the forest appeared almost unchanged. But beneath the surface, a quiet transformation had already begun. Within a year, researchers started noticing something unusual. Small clearings were appearing in the thick carpet of fallen leaves. Leaf litter depth measurements began declining. And tiny crab burrows, thousands of them, were suddenly appearing across the forest floor. The crabs were settling in. Yet the most dramatic ecological changes had not even begun. At first, the changes remained subtle. From above, the island still looked the same. The canopy of dense tropical forest stretched uninterrupted across hills and valleys, its green surface hiding the quiet activity unfolding below. But on the forest floor, the transformation was accelerating. Millions of tiny engineers had begun to reshape the island. Each crab consumed small fragments of leaves, fruit, and organic debris. Individually, the impact seemed insignificant. But together, the effect was enormous. Within just 2 years of the first major releases, scientists measuring leaf litter discovered something remarkable. In several monitoring zones, the depth of fallen leaves had declined by nearly 40%. Areas that once held thick carpets of decomposing plant matter now revealed patches of bare soil. The forest floor was breathing again. Researchers began documenting a surge in microbial activity within the soil. As crabs shredded and processed organic material, nutrients were rapidly returned to the ground in forms that plants could absorb. Nitrogen levels in some soil samples increased by up to 30% compared with measurements taken before the restoration project. Phosphorus concentrations also rose significantly. These nutrients, once locked inside layers of undecomposed leaves, were finally re-entering the ecosystem. Yet the most fascinating changes were only beginning to emerge. As crab populations continued expanding, the island's ecological chain reactions became increasingly visible. The crabs were not just recyclers. They were gardeners. By consuming large quantities of seeds and seedlings on the forest floor, crabs influence which plants are able to grow. At first glance, this might seem destructive. But in tropical ecosystems, selective seed consumption can actually increase biodiversity. Without crabs, fast-growing plant species often dominate the forest floor, forming dense layers that prevent other plants from establishing. But with crabs present, many of these aggressive species are kept in check. Researchers began noticing that certain invasive vines, plants that had spread rapidly during the decades without crabs, were suddenly declining. Seedlings of native tree species, meanwhile, were beginning to appear more frequently in cleared soil patches created by crab feeding activity. It was a subtle but powerful shift in ecological balance. In several study plots, the diversity of young tree species increased by nearly 25% within just 4 years. The forest was reorganizing itself. But crabs were influencing far more than plants. Their presence began reshaping the island's entire food web. One of the first animals to respond was the island's bird population. For years, ground-nesting birds had struggled to reproduce successfully. Dense leaf litter made it difficult to locate food, while the altered vegetation structure reduced suitable nesting areas. But as crabs cleared the forest floor, conditions began improving. Insects, which thrive in nutrient-rich soil, began increasing in number. And birds noticed. Several species that had become rare were suddenly being observed more frequently during field surveys. One small insectivorous bird, once seen only a few times per year, was recorded more than 50 times during a single breeding season. The forest floor had become a productive feeding ground once again. Meanwhile, the burrowing activity of the crabs was producing another unexpected effect. Across the island, millions of crab burrows were appearing beneath the soil. Each burrow allowed air and water to penetrate deeper into the ground, improving soil aeration and drainage. This process, known as biodiversity, plays a critical role in maintaining healthy soils. Over time, scientists discovered that areas with high crab burrow density held significantly higher moisture levels during dry seasons. The burrows acted like tiny reservoirs, helping rainwater infiltrate deeper underground rather than evaporating from the surface. Plants growing near these burrows often showed faster growth rates. The crabs were not only restoring the present ecosystem, they were strengthening its resilience against future environmental stress. 5 years after the initial releases, the scale of the transformation had become undeniable. Crab populations had expanded dramatically. Field surveys estimated that tens of millions of crabs were now living across the island. Seasonal migrations began returning as well. During certain months, massive waves of adult crabs moved across the forest toward the coast to reproduce. From the air, researchers once again observed moving bands of color across hillsides, an ecological spectacle that had not been seen for nearly a century. The island was reclaiming one of its most ancient rhythms, and with it came a cascade of ecological recovery. Leaf litter processing rates now closely matched those measured in healthy tropical crab ecosystems elsewhere in the Pacific. Seedling survival rates improved significantly. The structure of the forest floor, once suffocated beneath layers of debris, had returned to a dynamic balance of soil, seedlings, and organic material. But perhaps the most surprising discovery came from long-term vegetation surveys. Scientists expected the forest to recover gradually. Instead, the ecosystem appeared to be reorganizing itself faster than anyone predicted. Within 7 years of the first crab reintroductions, some monitoring zones displayed plant communities strikingly similar to historical records from the early 20th century. Species that had nearly vanished were reappearing. Native trees once pushed aside by invasive vegetation were reclaiming territory. The ecosystem was remembering how to function. The success of the crab restoration project began attracting global attention. Ecologists from around the world traveled to the island to study what had happened. The experiment demonstrated something profound. Restoring just one key species, when that species plays a central ecological role, can trigger massive ecosystem recovery. In scientific terms, these species are known as keystone organisms. Their presence supports entire ecological networks. Remove them and the system begins to collapse. Restore them and life returns.